This is the fourth part of the stories I found regarding the enslaved ancestors of the Jackson family. My name is Andre, and I'm a genealogist who helps people to discover their history. We left off on January 28th, 1858, marking the day that Nero had lost the rest of his family. This was a very clear example of the violence of natal alienation that the Jackson family's ancestors endured. The natal alienation of Black folks gives coherence to white people. There was no kinship ties among slaves that was respected and regarded legally, regardless of whether those ties were acknowledged by white people. The division of Jenny's children and grandchildren served the white Gales. It reified them. It gave them a sense of being, bequeathing slaves to heirs in last will and testaments, inspections and appraisals of slaves, being the estate that gets divided up and given over to heirs, all served to reinforce that they were the humans who had access to kinship structures. The division of slaves were reminders that participating and benefiting from the structural denial of Black folks' access to kinship was how they were able to understand what family was. The violence of natal alienation that Nero and his family endured only meant that the white Gales were a family. It affirmed them as heirs. It confirmed their connection to Josiah and Mary Gale, and it affirmed their connections with one another as co-heirs. It solidified them as a family, keeping them intact and being able to function. His father, July, was now the slave of his biological half-nephew, James Richburg Gale, who lived in Point Coupe Parish, Louisiana. The 1860 slave schedule reveals that James Richburg Gale was the owner of 21 slaves, one of which is listed as a 56-year-old male. This has to be July. I couldn't find any records that discussed anything that had to do with July during the Civil War, but I did find this book revealing that in December 1864, Union troops of the 24th Indiana Volunteer Company were traveling in Louisiana on the lookout for a Confederate militia in Point Coupe. The Union troop arrived at James Richburg Gales' plantation and was greeted by one of his sons with bullets. He ran into the swamp while the Union soldiers camped at the plantation. Union soldier Benjamin Summers wrote, "A large number of hogs and chickens were gathered for the purpose of giving our boys a big Christmas, so they were appropriated as contraband of war." I'm sure July was there for this. This is a picture of James Richburg Gales' big house in Louisiana. I also couldn't find any documents regarding Sarah Caulfield's estate, the woman who now owned Nero. I do know that she lived 33 miles away in East Feliciana Parish, and she supposedly died in 1860. Although I could not find any documentation of the period when Sarah was the owner of Nero to the end of the Civil War in 1865, I did find a clue in the 1910 census record. The record gives a clue that Nero had been part of the Confederacy Army during the Civil War, but given the context of that Nero was a slave during this time, it's very likely that Nero was forced to labor for the Confederate Army. Joe Jackson did have some tidbits about Nero's life during that time. Joe Jackson wrote, "Nero had been sold to a plantation in Louisiana. He, along with the other slaves, had to eat and were told by the owners to kneel before a low trough, which he had to scoop with a spoon. Soon, Nero had enough of this and ran away. The owner of the plantation immediately sent people who searched all night long and caught the slave on the river miles away from the plantation. They beat up Nero so badly that he lost liters of blood. Some months later, when Nero recovered, his owner wanted to sell him, but slaves who had previously escaped were impossible to sell under the same high price. So instead, the owner decided to force Nero to work as much as possible. My grandfather was tormented on crude cotton fields of the South, held down on hands and legs. Once the fetters were removed, Nero dared again to run away. This time, the owner of the plantation himself headed a search group and appointed an award to the one who would catch Nero. He was afraid that other slaves would follow his example if he did not catch him. And when he finally tracked Nero down, he took a heated chimney nipper and squeezed his nose with it until Nero fell down. He left my grandfather to lie on the ground because he thought that Nero was dead, but he was so strong and he had gone through this awful punishment. Those scars of the burn have remained with him up until the end of his days. I could not find any documentation to support this. However, these stories passed down within the family really speak to the gratuitous violence of slavery, and that how every wound that was inflicted isn't always written down in a primary source. By April 10th, 1865, the Confederacy surrendered to the Union Army. Slavery was abolished in word, but the world that made slavery possible persisted and continues to persist to this day. Records after 1865 give us snapshots of how Nero was able to navigate or attempt to navigate the anti-Black world of Reconstruction. In November 1865, Mississippi was the first state to enact a set of Black codes whose purpose was to preserve white supremacy, control labor and movement, as well as civil rights of the newly freed Black folks. One of the civil rights that was given to Black folks was legally binding marriages. On the last day of the year 1868, Nero and a woman named Emmeline Dunn were married in Amite County, Mississippi. This reveals that Nero was able to get from Louisiana back to Mississippi. Not only that, it reveals that he utilized the last name Coalfield. Jackson family oral history says that July's nickname was Jack, and Nero was known as Jack's son, who later then used the surname Jackson. This record suggests that Nero utilized the last name Coalfield first, the last name of the last person who had enslaved him, his biological half-cousin. The 1880 federal census is the first record I could find where Nero utilizes the last name Jackson, so it seems that during his time of freedom, he was taking ownership of himself by choosing his last name. That same year when Nero was in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, July is listed in Amite County, Mississippi, and he utilizes the last name Gale, the last name of the last person who owned him, his biological half-nephew. This was the last record I found during July's lifetime referencing him. I don't know when he passed away, but family members say that he lived to be 104 years old, but I had not found any documentation to support that. Joe Jackson wrote that Nero would go out into the woods gathering herbs and creating medicines that he used to sell to people in the community. He wrote that he helped a lot of people and he ended up making a lot of money from this that he was able to utilize to purchase land in cash. This lines up with this 1888 deed that I found where Nero pays $100 for 117 acres of land in Amite County. This deed says that he was going to pay $77.38 over 5 years to pay off the rest of the land. But the catch is there was interest. By 1893, he owed $257.01. He had to put the land into a trust or else he risked losing the land. However, it seems that he was able to pay what he owed. Interestingly, that same year, I found that he had to go to court and was charged with perjury, but was later found not guilty. I was not able to find the details of this case, so I don't have much about that. In 1900, I found that he went into a joint venture with 2 other men to purchase land from a white woman named Fanny Smith in Amite County. They agreed to do 3 installments of $350 with 10% interest, all to purchase 280 acres of land. And they were able to do it. In 1906, Nero was able to have those 2 men pay him for land. In 1910, he's 65 years old and he's listed in the census as an employer, suggesting that he hired workers that he was paying. In 1920, he went into a 5-year lease agreement with the Texas Oil Company where they paid him $200 each year so that they could explore his land for oil. Joe Jackson wrote about this and said that the oil company made $1.2 million. It was definitely a lopsided deal, and that Nero should have gotten way more money for what he had signed that lease for. But this was sadly not the last time that Nero would be taken advantage of. Stay tuned for the last and final part of the stories I found about the Jackson family's enslaved ancestors.